Going and here we go. I will turn it over to Ilan here.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the lovely introduction. Welcome, everyone, to your Native Bees 101 course. We're going to really dive down into our native pollinators with obviously a big focus on bees. And first, I'm going to talk, though, a little bit about the Alberta Native Bee Council. So a lot of you might not really be familiar with us. We're a relatively new organization. We started in 2017. And the goal of our organization is really to promote conservation of native pollinators with a focus on bees. We do that both through research and monitoring, as well as through outreach and education, like I'm doing right now. The reason we were created is really due to a lack of knowledge on native bees, and you'll see some stats that I'm going to show in a little bit that will kind of highlight that. So this is one pie chart I always love to show whenever I'm talking about bugs because, we have so many conservation efforts that focus on the large vertebrates, especially the charismatic fauna, like the really big mammals, and everyone loves birds, and they do a lot for us. They're beautiful, but they really represent a very small fraction of life on Earth. This is a chart of all named animals, period. So it includes, everything from the tiny little crustaceans and shrimp and little plankton to large mammals and birds and fish and all those vertebrate groups. And basically everything in shades of blue is invertebrates. And then that tiny little pie slice of the green and the black is vertebrates. So, invertebrates make up the majority of life on Earth, and most of that is insects. They're incredibly successful. There's a common stat that like 30% of all animals on Earth are just beetles alone. And I think that has since been outdone by wasps. Tiny parasitic wasps have basically brought up the wasps to outnumber the beetles now. So huge diversity. And not just, they're not just incredibly diverse, but with that diversity, they're abundant and they're really important in our ecosystems. So they serve all sorts of functions in the ecosystem. Pollination, insects are some of the best pollinators, in particular bees. Nutrient cycling is a big one. So moving nutrients through the ecosystem, a lot of our decomposers, in addition to fungi, are also insects. And so without those kind of that cleanup crew of the dung beetles, the flies, and all those insects we might not think of as very, clean or super appealing to some people, they really have a very important role to play as decomposers. I always like to say, without dung beetles and flies consuming like dung, we would be walking knee deep through the forest in dung and poop. So thank goodness our cleanup crew is there cleaning all of that waste and recycling those nutrients back into the ecosystem. Some of the best pest control for pest insects is other insects. So, with the diversity of insects out there, pretty much every plant has an insect that feeds on it. And when there are plants that we care about, we call those insects pests. And the best control of pest insects is other insects. I always like to bring up wasps because a lot of people get really angry with wasps. They feel like they don't do a lot for us. They are pollinators, but they're not as good as bees. But wasps are actually the best control of caterpillars. That's one of their favorite foods, as well as aphids. And so, with those huge forest tent caterpillar outbreaks that we occasionally get in Alberta, where the forest tent caterpillar eats every leaf off of every tree, and there's literally so many caterpillars, they're piling along the road, and it becomes too slippery to drive because you're driving over dead caterpillars. That's how bad they can be, and wasps keep those populations in check. So they're very important as pest control. With their biodiversity and abundance, they're going to be a very important part of the food web. And so they are a food source for a lot of different animals. They're small, so they're at kind of the base of the food chain in a lot of cases. And there was a study that estimated the value of these ecosystem services that I mentioned. In the US alone, it was estimated to be $57 billion, and that was back in 2006. Now, I have a question for the audience. Let's get an idea of how well everyone is going into this knows their bees. So I've got these numbered pictures here. Please throw into the chat any numbers that you think are not a bee. And I'll give you guys a minute to think about it, take a good look at these insects here, and tell me which ones you might think are not a bee. You'll notice there's a huge diversity here. I've got different colors, different shapes of bugs there, and I'm already seeing some answers here, and it kind of is already showing you that there is a diversity of bees out there. So I'm seeing a lot of numbers being thrown into the chat here. I'm seeing number 1 and number 10. Those are actually both sweat bees in the genus Agapostemon. They're tiny little shiny bees. So number 10 is green. It's not yellow and black at all. So definitely not all bees are yellow and black. Um, Number 8 really looks like a wasp. That is a yellow-faced bee in the genus Hylaeus, and they are also tiny little bees, but they are really not fuzzy at all. So not all bees are hairy. Um, I see a whole bunch of other numbers here. Number 4 is a blood bee. They're actually cuckoo bee that they'll like drink a little bit of blood if they see a dead animal. And they're cuckoo bees, which means they lay their eggs in the nests of other bees. Um, Number 5 is also a type of cuckoo bee. So some of these cuckoo bees don't really look like other bees, but they are still pollinators. They are still going and collecting pollen and nectar. Now, some people are saying all of these are bees. And the first person that entered the chat or that wrote in the chat guessed number 9, and they actually guessed the only one that is not a bee. Number 9 is a type of hoverfly. There are also bee flies that look very similar. So bee flies and hoverflies really look like bees. They are pollinators. They're hanging out on flowers. They even buzz like a bee, some of them. And this number 9 looks more like a bee than any other bees on this picture. So, or any of the other insects in this picture. So they can be really convincing. And you'll see a lot of insects impersonating bees and wasps when they have no defenses of their own. So flies, especially hoverflies and bee flies, have no way to defend themselves. And so instead, they just mimic an insect that has a painful sting, and that way predators are unlikely to go after them. And I will talk about the other bees in this picture as we go through some of the bees. So bees, as all of you probably know, really provide that important pollination service. And in fact, bees are commonly thought of as the best pollinator. The reason for that being is that they feed on not just nectar like butterflies and hummingbirds, they actually eat the pollen as well. That means they really want to get in there all into that pollen. They usually end up covered in that pollen. And so if you think about like a butterfly, they kind of have long legs. And so they can kind of stand on these stilt-like legs. They're not really rubbing up against the flower and getting covered in a lot of pollen. Hummingbirds too, some of them might not be as amazing pollinators if their long bill is able to reach the nectar without them having to get their whole face in there. Bees, they want to get the pollen. So no matter what, they're going for that pollen. And not only that, they are pretty hairy, and that helps move that pollen along. The hair also helps them collect pollen for what they eat, but as they're moving from flower to flower, they're inevitably going to drop some pollen grains onto the flowers as well. Now, we have a huge diversity of bees in Alberta, and it's not like Alberta is special. The bees are just incredibly diverse because insects are incredibly diverse. So we've got 375 bee species in Alberta. That is more than double the fish, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians combined. So that's almost as many species as we have birds, and birds will migrate across the whole continent. It's pretty impressive number. Now, of those, only 30 of them are bumblebees, which most people are quite familiar with. So we do have a lot of bumblebee species, but compared to the rest of the bees, it's just a small fraction. And then there are also 5 non-native species, and I'm going to talk about the European honeybee, which is a non-native species. So this is another pie chart, and this is a pie chart of Alberta's bees, and it shows their conservation status. And so, 29% are secure. That's really nice to see. There are 2% that are, maybe apparently secure. 9% are vulnerable. But here's this really scary part here. 58% of the bee species in Alberta are data deficient. We simply don't have the data to say whether or not they're of conservation concern. And that's frightening because, they might disappear before we even get the chance to qualify them as an endangered species. So the reason for this is due to a lack of data. And so, just because something is rare doesn't mean you can say that it's endangered. You need long-term monitoring studies in order to really say something like that and get a species on the endangered species list. And so that's something we're doing, and I'll talk about that next. But some of the threats that native bees are facing are kind of the reason that this is a little bit scary. So one of the main threats is habitat loss. This is actually cited as the #1 threat to animals across the globe right now. As climate change, if that becomes a larger issue, then we may see that as kind of becoming the #1 reason for animal loss. But right now, it's habitat loss. As we're developing native land into urban areas, monocultures, things like that, as our population grows and our needs grow. Pesticide poisoning is also an important threat to bees. In particular, this is really bad with systemic insecticides. So, systemic insecticides are insecticides that are taken up by the root of the plant. And for example, all of our canola, along with a lot of other crop seeds, the seed is treated with neonicotinoids. It's a seed coat. So when that seed sprouts, the roots absorb the neonicotinoids that were covering the seed, and those are incorporated into the plant's system. That means that it's now in all of the plant's tissues, in all of its cells, including the nectar and the pollen that's produced. And so those neonicotinoids and whatever other systemic insecticides are then being taken up by pollinators, which are not their target. And so neonicotinoids, for example, I'm repeating them a lot because they are used in Canada, but they've been banned and the US, they're used as well, but they've been banned in Europe and as well as a lot of countries around the world. For their harmful effects on pollinators. Now, they don't kill the bees directly, but they basically have been shown to have non-lethal effects on the bees where, it might make it more difficult for them to find their way home, to navigate, to communicate directions. Basically, they kind of act like they're drunk. And if you imagine a whole office building full of drunk people, they're probably not going to do a very efficient job. And so a hive full of drunk acting bees is also not going to be very efficient. And, that can cause all sorts of problems. Pathogens, so disease spread is a big risk to bees, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. And I already kind of mentioned climate change. I'm not going to, beat that dead horse. So there have been studies that have shown this decline in insects, and the issue is to show that decline because insect populations are so variable year to year. You really need these long-term studies, and those are kind of far and few between. We need more of them. One in Germany was held in a national park, and they found a 75% decrease in the biomass, the abundance of the insects that they captured in these. They were flying insects captured in malaise traps. So that's a huge drop over 27 years. And they've estimated that 40% of insect species might go extinct over the next few decades. So what are we doing to, better combat this? So one thing we need to do is monitor our insect species. And what we are monitoring are bees around the province. So, butterflies are one of the few insects that have a lot of history behind them because there's a lot of collectors and hobbyists. But bees don't really have a lot of data, much like a lot of other insect groups. And we are here to get that data. So we run 5-year monitoring programs where every 5 year we are monitoring bees across the province. So because of COVID, it was a little bit more than a 5-year gap. It was 6 years. But the idea is that back in 2018, we sampled 112 sample locations. And since then, we've actually expanded in the last year to 150 sample locations with our partners at Alberta Forestry, among other partners. We were able to get traps out to even the most remote areas of northern Alberta. So it's really expanded our data set. And we've found we collected tens of thousands of bees. And, the reason we do this every 5 years is to make sure that we're not harming the populations. Unfortunately, with insects, you do need to collect them in order to identify them to species due simply to that diversity and the lack of morphological variation that you really need to get a bee under a scope, along with a lot of insects to be able to identify it to species. So that's why it's done in this way. And I'm happy to answer any questions about that later. And through our monitoring program, we have actually found 15 potential new records for bees that weren't originally recorded in Alberta due to just like maybe range expansion, or maybe they just weren't detected here due to a lack of data. We have found more bees here, and we did find all of our bumblebee species along with quite a diversity of other bees. And this data will be publicly available. And so this is kind of something I want to highlight is native bees versus non-native bees. In particular, I'm going to bring up the case of the honeybee as a non-native bee. So the European honeybee, Apis mellifera, is used across Canada and the United States for honey production as well as to pollinate our crops in agriculture. It is one species, Apis mellifera. In Asia and in Australia, they may have other species, but this is the one that's widely used, most widely used across the world, actually. And so they're used to pollinate our crops. They are important in honey production. But notice I'm really emphasizing the word crops. They're not a native species, so they're not important in pollinating our native plants and our wild plants. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. So honeybee colonies are quite different than native bees. Most native bees are solitary bee species. So 340 of those bees are solitary bees where they don't have a queen. It's kind of every bee for herself. And bumblebees do nest in colonies, but they're quite small in terms of number. They might have about 100 individuals, not too much more. Honeybees, in comparison, might have 50,000 bees in a single colony. That's kind of a normal number that we're seeing, and so huge amount of mouths to feed in one hive. This means they have a really high resource demands. And honeybees are not native, right? They're from Europe. North America doesn't have any native honeybee species, so we are obligated to use a non-native honeybee species. That's why we use them. And then native bees obviously belong here. They're native, and so they have close relationships with our native plants. In some cases, there might be certain flowers that are only pollinated by a single species of bee. And in return, that single species of bee might only pollinate one or a few species of native plant. So sometimes these relationships are really tight, and that's why we need to make sure that we can serve not just our plants, but our native insects as well. Honeybees are a livestock species. They are kept by humans. That means their populations are basically at our whim. When honeybees die, 1 year, we can breed more the next year and, bump their populations up. And so honeybees can face declines over time as well, but they have us to help them. Chickens can face declines too. They're never going to go extinct because we're always there to breed more. And so it's the same with honeybees. They don't need our conservation help because they're a livestock species. Native bees are wildlife. They face all the same threats as honeybees, but they don't have people to, boost their populations every year, to treat them for diseases, and to make sure that they're healthy. They're wildlife, and so it's much more difficult to do that. The biggest issues for our native bees are from honeybees are competition and disease transfer. So one honeybee colony, it might have 50,000 honeybees. One study here estimated that they consume enough food that could be produce 100,000 native bees. Now, I mentioned, of course, honeybees are used in agriculture. They're really necessary for agriculture because we can move their hives around. We can plop them in the middle of a giant monoculture that's only going to be blooming for a few weeks. And that means that field will have no food for the rest of the summer. But hey, we can move those bees there. Native bees will also pollinate in agriculture, but they might only pollinate around the perimeter of the field where they're living. They are estimated to pollinate about 30% of agricultural crops in terms of number, or like quantity, not species. And so they do have a role in agriculture. Native bees are definitely pulling their weight, but we will need honeybees to pollinate our crops because of the way our farming system is set up. But they're for our crops. They aren't necessary to pollinate your garden. We got 375 native bee species that can do that work, and they are living in your backyard right now. So one of the issues with honeybees, not just competition. So sorry, going back to this, I just want to highlight, this is 50,000 mouths to feed, and honeybees will forage over about a 5-kilometer radius. So that means they're consuming flowers from every flower in that 5-kilometer radius. And that's a lot of competition. That's from those native bees. They're going to be consuming a lot of their resources. This really becomes a problem in urban environments where there is a lack of floral resources. And, for example, I'm going to call out AMA. They put like 20 beehives on their roofs. They didn't really plant any plants. They just put bees on their roofs in the middle of the city where there isn't a lot of plants in the first place and not a lot of flowers. And those native bees that are living here need all the help they can get. And now you're just putting more competition for them. They're also doing it, under the guise that it's supporting biodiversity, which it's just one non-native species. It's not supporting biodiversity. So that's kind of one of the reasons I'm really highlighting this difference is to prevent confusion like this in the future. Um, and one of the other reasons that honeybees are an issue is because they have been, honeybees get a lot of diseases. Just like any livestock species, we have to treat them for a lot of these diseases. They're carted all across the country, across the world. And so diseases are moved from place to place and they accumulate diseases, which means that, from all countries around the world, these bees have gotten diseases now. And we monitor for them and we manage those diseases with, medicine. Whether it's acaricides to kill mites, fungicides to kill fungus, any pesticides or any sort of medicine that we can basically help our bees fight off any diseases they may get. Now, our native bees don't get any medicine. And so when they get those diseases, they just die. Honeybees are basically be treated for those diseases and keep them at low levels so that they're not impacting their health. But they can still transmit those diseases to wild bees. This is still something that's being studied right now, but we have started to see disease transfer from honeybees to our native bees. So one of the biggest kind of enemies of honeybees is the varroa mite. You can see this little red dot on the abdomen of this developing honeybee in its cell. And it can spread a variety of diseases, including one called deformed wing virus, which literally deforms the wings of the bees as they're developing so they can't fly. Well, a bee that can't fly isn't very useful. And so, they basically jump out of the hive and fall to their death. And we didn't used to ever see that in our native bees, and now we're starting to see this deformed wing virus. This is a picture of a bumblebee that has had it. So I may have kind of hounded on honeybees here a little bit, but we still need honeybees. Our managed bee industry, the managed bee industry can't come at the expense of our wild bees. Honeybees are necessary in our agriculture. They're the only bees we can get honey from because other bees don't produce honey in large enough amounts. Bumblebees produce very little honey. Their colony doesn't need to survive over the winter, and so they don't need large food stores. I see that question in the chat there. So honey provides long-term food storage, especially over the winter, and for a large colony. Bumblebees simply don't need to make as much, but they do make some. And then solitary bees don't really make honey for the most part because they don't have a colony, so they don't need their food to last a long time. They just need it to last for that one larva that they're laying at a time. So the reason I'm really highlighting this is, we never talk about chickens and wild birds in the same sentence, but we always seem to do that with bees. We always seem to lump honeybees and our native bees into the same sentence, even though honeybees are a livestock species. They're kept by us. And so I really just want everyone to kind of reframe the way they think about honeybees, thinking of them as a livestock species. Keeping honeybees in your yard is not going to save the bees. It's not going to support conservation or support the environment. Supporting our native bees is the way to support the environment. Honeybees are fantastic to keep if you love honey. But if you are keeping bees, just make sure you're managing them effectively so that they don't have diseases that are being transmitted to our native bees. And, consider maybe planting some more flowers around the area to reduce that amount of competition. Now let's talk about our native bees. Let's really get into the meat and potatoes of this presentation. So we've got 30 bumblebee species in Alberta. These are the bees that most people are a little more familiar with. So they have kind of your typical life cycle where the queen is the one doing all of the reproduction, and then all of the workers that are doing all the work, building the nest, foraging, they're all female. Whoa, okay, sorry, my mouse just went through like 3 slides. Go back. Go back. Okay, sorry about that. So That's the drones, on the other hand, are what we call the male bumblebees. This is the same with honeybees, so there's a lot of parallels between the two. And the males are just used for reproduction. They don't really contribute to the colony by foraging. So they're really just there produced during the mating season. So the life cycle of these four bumblebee species are considered endangered or threatened by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada. And in reality, there's probably a lot more. We just don't have the data to say that for sure. Now, this is what the bumblebee life cycle might look like. Oh my God, this mouse is awful. Okay, I'm going to use my keyboard. In the springtime, like right now, the new queens that were created last year are emerging from the leaf litter. And they will go around, surveying the ground, looking for a hole in the ground, usually an old rodent burrow, and they'll crawl in there, and that's where they'll start their nest. Now, it doesn't actually have to be an old rodent burrow. They can occupy rodent burrows that are already occupied, and they will basically walk into that rodent burrow. If it's something small like a mouse, they can just sting that mouse in the face and say, "Get out of here," evict the mouse from its own home, and take it over. So I think that's pretty badass. That to say that being said, they're going to avoid a fight if there's other options available. So usually they're nesting in some sort of cavity, often a rodent burrow. The new queen will forage around, gathering pollen and nectar, and she'll build these wax pots in which she'll lay an egg. And each one will have a single egg and a whole bunch of food that she has provided for it. Once those eggs hatch and develop into adult bees, they go through their larval and their pupal stage and develop into an adult bee. Those are the first generation of workers. Once her first generation of workers is done, she no longer needs to go forage and she will never leave the hive again. So she will spend the rest of her life in the colony laying eggs for future generations. And so more generations of workers are born. They're doing the rest of the work in the colony, building the honey pots, building the wax pots for the larvae. The honey pots are the little wax pots where they store their honey. So I'll show you a picture of what that looks like. It's kind of different from what, if you're imagining a honeybee hive looks like with those octagonal cells or hexagonal cells. In the usually late summer or sometime in the summer, the male bees will be produced and they will leave the hive along with the new queens that are produced. So you can call them princesses if you'd like. And so those princesses and nobody else calls them princesses. It's not a scientific term, so don't repeat it. But that's what I'm going to call them. So these princesses, these unmated queens, and these males are emerging from the colony, and they leave and go on what's called a nuptial flight, where they go and try to mate with members from other colonies. Once these princesses have mated, they are now a queen. They are ready to lay eggs, but they will have to wait until the next season. The males will die shortly after mating. Their genitals basically explode and leave them with an open wound, and so they basically just like bleed out and die. The males really can't live long after mating, but they go out doing what they love. And the new queens will then go find a nice safe space in the leaf litter. So they actually leave their colony and say, "Goodbye, I'm going to go spend the winter somewhere else." Usually they burrow under the leaf litter, which is why it's good not to rake your leaves in the fall. There's all sorts of beneficial insects, including new queen bees, hiding out in those leaves. Better to wait until May long weekend the next spring. And honestly, by then, most of those leaves will have broken down and fertilized your lawn. So that's what the life cycle of a bumblebee will be like. This is what a bumblebee nest looks like. So you can see those honey pots, and some of them will have just honey. Some of them might have a larva, especially the sealed ones will have a larva or a pupa developing in there into an adult bee. So that large bee in the middle there is the queen. You can see she is quite a bit larger than the workers. Now, if you are interested in identifying bumblebees, we do have some resources on our website. These are bumblebee identification guides. They are available as PDFs that you can print at home if you'd like. Some people already might have these pamphlets if you've seen us at any events. And so we've got some great identification guides on our website that you can use to help you identify the bumblebees in your own backyard. And it's really easy. You can see, they all look relatively different. You kind of just need a good photo where you can see the whole top side of the bumblebee or the whole side view so you can count the stripes. Now, bumblebees aren't the only members of their family. So bumblebees are in the family Apidae. That is the same family as honeybees, which is why they share a lot of characteristics like having a colony and producing honey. But there are some solitary bees in the family Apidae as well. Um, so the ones pictured here are some of my favorites. They're longhorn bees in the genus Melisodes. There are also some in the genus Eucera. And there are a few others but they're not super diverse. Mostly it's the bumblebees. But I love these longhorn bees. The males have such long antennae, they look adorable. And then the females will have these big pollen collecting structures on their legs. So bumblebees and honeybees have pollen collecting structures on their legs too. It's called a corbicula. It's also called a pollen basket. And it looks like a bunch of hairs that are on two sides and they're curved inside and they can pack the pollen in the middle and inside is kind of a smooth cup shape. These guys do something different. Instead, their legs are covered in hairs and it looks like they're wearing bell bottoms and they just pack that pollen on there. And it's so cute. They've got these big yellow bell bottoms. Um, Now, these are often called digger bees. Squash bees are also in this family, and they're all solitary ground nesters, so they nest into the ground. Some of them will nest communally, where they might nest next to each other, but they don't have a queen that's doing all the reproduction. Okay, I'm clicking for the next slide, but I think it's just frozen. Yep, okay, there we go. Um, so another family of bees, I'm going to go over 5 families, are the leafcutter bees. And leafcutter bees get their name from the fact that they cut these perfect circles or oval shapes out of leaves. They will use that to line a tube and separate that tube off into little cells where they will lay an egg with some pollen and nectar and provision it, and then that will grow into a bee in one of those cells. We do also use some species of leafcutter bee to pollinate alfalfa. So you might see leafcutter bees as a managed bee species. They've got these really big jaws, which is where the family gets its name, Megachilidae. It means like big jaws or big lips in Latin. And they also have a really hairy underside, their belly, because that's actually where their pollen collecting structures are. Okay, there we go. So sweat bees are another family of bees. These are also mostly ground nesting bees. A lot of them really like sandy soil. Some of them are green and shiny and iridescent and look like little jewels, particularly those in the genus Agapostemon. And they get their name sweat bees because they will actually drink sweat. So if you're outside on a hot day and sweating, you might see one of these little bees land on you. Some of them are really, really small too. And, they might even look like a fruit fly or something like that. So unless it's a mosquito, if a bee or if a small insect is landing on you, don't slap it. It could be, a helpful little sweat bee. Mosquitoes are really the only ones you should be slapping. Nothing else will hurt you. And if it is something that will sting you, you don't want to slap it. So, mining bees are another type of bee. These are in the family Andrenidae. These ones, as you might have guessed from their name, they mine in the ground, so they're ground nesters. They're very diverse. They're quite abundant, and come in a huge variety of sizes. So this one on the left is kind of about the size of a big honeybee, your typical kind of bee size. And then you can see that tiny one it's actually on my boss's finger. That's a really small little andrenid as well. So it includes actually the smallest bee species in Canada. So they're quite diverse. And they are all ground nesters. These ones, plaster bees, some of them will nest in wood, some of them will nest in the ground. The ones in the left will nest in wood, the ones on the right will nest on the ground. Some of them are called yellow-faced bees, and they really look like wasps. Those are in the genus Hylaeus. Some of them look a little bit more like bumblebees or honeybees in the genus Calides. And so the reason they get their name plaster bees is because some of them will use a mixture of saliva to create something that looks kind of like cellophane or like plastic wrap. And they use that substance to line their nests, and it actually makes it waterproof. So if it rains, they won't drown. So solitary bees have a little bit of a different life cycle. This is an example of a ground nesting bee life cycle. So the adult bees will actually be active more in the summer. And in the summer, they're gathering pollen, nectar, and they're digging a hole and basically creating a little ball of pollen and nectar in which they will, no, don't go back, on which they will lay a single egg. And that egg will hatch, grow into a larva, and then in the late spring and the fall, it will pupate. And they'll typically spend the winter as a pupa tucked away under the safety of the soil. Now, some cuckoo bees, which I mentioned before, will take advantage of this and basically lay their eggs on that in that nest on that same ball of pollen and nectar. Some of them will even like basically that their egg is like ready to hatch. It can grow faster. It might outcompete the larva of the bee that made that home, or it might even eat the larva. And so it will basically take over. So stem nesting bees have kind of a similar life cycle. The difference being that instead of nesting in the ground and creating a cell for each egg, they will nest in a tube. So this might be in a hollow stem from a hollow stem plant. There's a lot of native species of plants that have these hollow stems they can nest in. And it can also be in a hole in wood excavated often by a beetle. So when beetle larvae grow in wood, they emerge and leave a perfect tube which bees can then use to nest in. If a log is rotting, it will also create all sorts of channels and tubes that the bees can nest in. So it's a great way to add some biodiversity to your yard is just with a dead log. So let's talk about what bees need. We talked a little bit about the bees. Let's talk now about their resources. So this is really simple. They basically have two needs. They're not complex as humans. Emotionally, they have two basic needs. The first one being food. Now, this is not as simple. Their needs for food are a little bit more complex, but it's just food. They eat pollen and nectar, but they'll feed on a diversity of flower types and different flower shapes and sizes. These are all native wildflowers in Alberta. And you can see they come in a huge variety of shape sizes, and that's because we have a huge variety of shapes and sizes of our bees, 370 native bee species. And so if you are planning a garden, it is good to keep in mind, you want flowers blooming at different times of the year, so they're not all blooming in June, for example, or July. And you also want different sizes, shapes, colors to attract the different species of bees. The native plants are much better for bees because they have all of the nutrients that they need to survive. A lot of ornamental plants aren't bred for pollen and nectar. Sometimes the bees might not even be able to access the middle of the flower, like with ornamental roses, where there's just too many petals in the way. All right. And the second thing bees need is shelter. So bees, because they raise their larvae at home, they need a home for their larvae. So most bees will nest in the ground or in wood, or like bumblebees in rodent burrows, which are also in the ground. And so some bees will nest in bare soil. Some of the sweat bees will nest in sandy soil that's exposed. So having some exposed bare soil, bare ground in the garden can provide important sites for these ground nesting bees. And you really don't want to disturb these sites, especially with mulching and tilling, if you know you have ground nesting bees there. About 30% of native bees nest in wood tunnels. So if you leave like snags and logs and stuff in your yard, or if you have plants with pithy stems that are hollow, that provides important nesting habitat for mason and leafcutter bees. You can also provide habitat just by having brush piles, rock piles, bunch grasses, old rodent burrows, anything that can kind of create a little cavity, and that'll provide opportunities for bumblebees, as well as places for other beneficial insects to hibernate. So which yard looks more appealing to a bee? I would probably guess that most of our listeners would say that the yard on the right looks more appealing to bees. So the yard on the left is a manicured lawn. It's basically a dead zone. There is no plants, there's no food resources. There's also no nesting habitat because they can't get in between that tightly packed grass. Whereas if you look on the yard on the right, there's diversity. There's biodiversity in the flowers, there's diversity in habitat types. They've got bare soil, piles of rocks. They probably got a dead log somewhere in that yard. There's even a bumblebee box in the back on that red box on the tree. There's a bumblebee box, which I'll talk about later. So if you want to kind of make the conversion from, this yard, this heavily manicured yard, which is doing nothing for biodiversity, requires a lot of maintenance and water, to something more natural that requires very little maintenance, and especially very little water, little maintenance once it gets going. Um, you can start slow. It doesn't have to be all at once, especially if you don't have a lot of time on your hands. You can start with just transitioning maybe 1 square meter of your yard and plant some native wildflowers there. And you really want to focus on those native plant species because those are going to be the ones that are bringing in pollinators. And definitely avoid invasive plant species. If you see any packages of wildflowers that are not labeled, those are not wildflowers. Those are probably full of invasive species because they are not labeled, and those seeds are easy to gather. So you really want to make sure that if you're getting packs of wildflowers, it says what's on the back. In most cases, you're going to see that most of those are actually from Europe and not, in fact, wildflowers native to Alberta. So there are great places to get native wildflowers. There's seed exchanges, CD Sunday and Saturday events though that happen in the spring. There's also all sorts of great websites online that you can buy native wildflower seeds. I know West Coast Seeds has all sorts of pre-mixed ones for different areas, like the prairies and stuff. And we have our list, if you're looking in particular to get a few species that really support bees. We've got our list of top 12 wildflowers for Alberta bees on our website here. And the Alberta Invasive Species Council has a more expansive list of flowers to plant instead of kind of invasive or really competitive species. There's also lots you can do with landscaping to make your yard more hospitable to insects. Avoiding pesticide use, applying it at the time of the day when insects aren't really active, so early morning or after sunset. Definitely not when the flowers are in bloom and the pollinators are going for the flowers. And if you can, target the specific areas where those insects are rather than just spraying the whole plant. And easier said than done, but try to avoid plants that have systemic insecticides like neonicotinoids. You can also limit your use of mulch and weed barriers. If you are using mulch, you can use a more fine mulch. Those big bark pieces, the bees simply can't get through them and they can't move them aside. These are something that have kind of been a fad in recent years, these solitary bee hotels. This is an example of a really bad one, and that's what most of them look like. Unfortunately, 99% of the ones you find in stores do more harm for good than bees. So these are 4 things you need to keep in mind when you're thinking about solitary bee hotels. First, they shouldn't be too big. This is really obvious to flying predators and parasites that will go after the bees. By having such a high density in one place, it's just a big, buffet sign for predators and parasites. The other thing is they have to be about 6 inches deep. Most of them are quite shallow. If they're too shallow, leafcutter bees will only produce males. And that's because the males emerge first. They only produce them in shallow tubes. Males also not as important as the females, which are producing the next generation. So if you're skewing that sex ratio and getting a whole bunch of males, you're not getting a lot of females laying eggs for that next generation. The tubes should be variable in diameter because of the variety of bee species and sizes, and they should be made out of a material that is going to be breathable. So the bamboo doesn't allow moisture to penetrate through, and it can actually cause mold to build up in there. The other thing is you want to be able to either discard the tubes or clean them after use. Now, you can't just go dunking the whole thing in hot water because bees are overwintering in there. And so there's no time of year when it's going to be completely empty. You can't guarantee it. So by being able to kind of take out different parts or compartments or individual tubes, you can ensure that you're cleaning them or discarding them after they've been used. Otherwise, diseases and parasites build up because they survive over the winter and they build up year after year. And then it just becomes basically a death trap for any bees that are entering it. We've got a whole much more kind of expanded guide on this on our website that you can find, as well as kind of a larger page for making different ways you can make bee habitat without needing to do bee hotels. If you want to make habitat for bumblebees, you can create a bumblebee box. So bumblebees, remember, nest in colonies, so they need a cavity to nest in. They can't just nest in a tube. So similar to a birdhouse, this kind of cavity provides a nesting habitat for bumblebees. We do workshops on these. If anyone is from an organization that wants to do workshops, we do workshops where we build 30 bumblebee boxes. We come to you with all of the supplies to build them. You can feel free to reach out to me if you want to know more about that. And the interesting thing about this is it's part of our Bumblebee Box monitoring program where everyone that builds a box and everyone that has a box, you don't have to have built it yourself, is encouraged to go on our website every fall and report on their bee box. These boxes are still kind of relatively a new thing. We just still don't know their best favorite nesting preferences. So we use the data that people report to better understand what their really preferred bee box is. Do they want it on the ground 1 meter up, or do they want it painted, or the raw wood? We are still trying to better understand their preferences. The one thing we know for now, where we have enough data to say it's statistically significant, is that the bumblebee boxes should be placed in half sun or half shade, or half sun, half shade, not full sun or full shade. So if you're interested in building one, you don't have to participate in a workshop. You can build it yourself at home. You can see they're quite simple to build. The hardest part is just cutting out the wood. If you are able to cut out the wood, the rest is very, very easy. And I encourage you to use your old wood. You can use plywood. You can use warped wood, moldy wood. They do not care. And in fact, those little imperfections will help create airflow. So you can see there's a little gap here in this one. That's actually helping to create some natural airflow. So you don't want it to fit super, super tightly. You want tiny little gaps. And you want to follow our instructions because it gives you a recommended size and things like that and materials. And you do need to fill them also with some stuffing, and we use raw cotton. You can also use hamster bedding or rodent bedding since they use rodent burrows in the wild. So, what are some take-home things that you can do to help native bees? Well, one you've already done. You have now understood the difference between managed bees and native bees and the potential impacts that they can have on the potential impacts. Oh, it should say of managed bees on native bees. Sorry, that's a typo. So just by being more aware of that, you can help prevent things like greenwashing. In particular, there's even something called bee washing specifically, where companies like Alveol are selling beehives to other companies under the guise that they're supporting the environment. That's why AMA has 20 beehives on their roof. So we can prevent these kinds of confusion and making sure that conservation dollars are going to conserve native species and not going to these companies that are predating on this whole save the bee fad. We do need to save the bees, but which bees are important to know. You can create habitat for wild bees, incorporating biodiversity into your landscaping. Literally having a dead log in your yard, having a pile of sticks. You can actually dig a hole and pile sticks and leaves in there. That provides great habitat for a lot of ground nesting species, bumblebees, beneficial insects like ground beetles. If you're adding flowers to your yard, really focus on native species. And finally, you can support the Alberta Native Bee Council and the Alberta Native Plant Council, along with any other conservation organizations. You can become a member, get access to discounts for merch, volunteer opportunities. You can also just stay in touch with our newsletter and kind of keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening with bees. So you can sign up for our newsletter. It's 4 times a year. We don't bombard you, and it's just about our work and fun facts about bees. We do also have a merch store if you're looking to support us with by buying some merch. We used to sell these ANBC approved solitary bee hotels, which are really, really awesome. Unfortunately, the company is going out of business because manufacturing them is too expensive. And so we haven't found a suitable replacement yet. These are just some other books that you might be interested in. So the one on the left is kind of like the Bee Bible of North America. It's got all of our bees, great identification information, great biology information. Some of the others, there's the middle one is Plants That Bees Love, produced by the Xerces Society. It's not just native species though. And then there's all sorts of great children's books and things like that that you can read to kind of foster a passion for native bees and others. And I'll just leave this slide up. If anyone wants to connect with us, there's our email, there's our website there, and we do have social media. We're pretty active on Instagram, and I think those posts are automatically posted to Facebook as well. LinkedIn is definitely not as active. So now is some time for questions, and I can see here.